also in the School of History class in religion. He's a director of the Environmental Arts and Humanities, and is author of a number of prominent books and articles, including most recently, and I'm excited to plug it, his 2014 American Historical Association Birdsall Award-winning Arming Mother Nature, The Birth of Catastrophic Environmentalism, published in 2013 by Oxford University Press.
I swear I'm not going to win the award for least uplifting contribution, but I might win it, yeah. So one of the words that we most associate with the First World War is disillusionment. When I teach about the war, I point out that it was a key moment in challenging the notion that science and progress are connected, and that scientific ideas and innovative technologies were marks of civilization. The war itself was widely perceived at the time as a failure of civilization. What I'd like to focus on now is a different sort of disillusionment about the nature of war itself. I'll note a transition to, this is where it's not uplifting, maximizing death, using science and knowledge of the natural environment. While extermination was not due to warfare, the explicit marriage of the scientific enterprise to it seemed to be. And despite efforts to contend with the contradictions of that, we see instead a steady willingness over time to accept that science can and should be used as a force for maximizing death. This is a theme of my book, Arming Mother Nature, which looks at the collaboration between scientists and military leaders after World War II to use their knowledge of the natural world, including biological, chemical, radiological, and geophysical weapons, to plan a total war against the Soviet Union. Today I'll just discuss the First World War. In the interwar years, the mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead observed in his influential book, Science and the Modern World, that science is not a uniform drift toward better things. To Whitehead, science was becoming specialized. And of course it had to be. What scientists could know everything. And yet he was afraid of it. This situation has its dangers, he wrote. It produces minds in a groove. I always like that phrase. What did he mean by it? Narrow, compartmentalized, easily mobilized, and driven in a single direction without broader contextualization. That's what he was afraid of. We all are likely familiar, and we've heard some about this, with the staggering figures that robbed a generation of its youth, some 800,000 casualties at the Battle of Verdun alone. It was a war of attrition, which is a nice euphemism, isn't it? For a war with killing as an end, not just a means. And science, that supposed mark of civilization, was clearly implicated. Consider for a moment just how easily science was drawn into this war. And forgive the simplicity of my examples, those of you who are interested in the history of science. I only have time to list a few. German General Friedrich von Bernhardi famously said, having learned about Darwinian natural selection and its emphasis on competition for resources, quote, "War is a biological necessity." Geology also became military geology, Kriegsgeologie, in the rush to enroll experts for trench warfare on an unprecedented scale. That's where expertise came in. The science of wave propagation, usually associated with the golden age of classical physics at the end of the 19th century, became the science of triangulation for targeting artillery on land and submarines at sea. The miracle of flight became the romance of the dogfight and the first strategic bombing. The power of industrialization became the deadly efficiency of the machine gun. Strategy followed science. Supposedly war, according to Prussian thought left over from the Napoleonic era, was the continuation of politics by other means. But now, with these unfamiliar tools, war's object appeared to be the extermination and massive death of others, with science as the instrument. Before the war, Germany was the center of world trade in synthetic dyes and chemical fertilizers, and it was the uncontested leader of the science of chemistry. And yes, Germany was the first, but just the first, to develop and use chemical weapons. Some caused blisters, others caused choking. Many were intended to kill, and others to force men out of trenches to be gunned down. The most well-known person associated with this research was Fritz Haber, a German, who found a way to weaponize chlorine. The most well-known use of chemical weapons was at Ypres, Belgium, Using sulfur, YPR is spelled Y-P-R-E-S. Using sulfur, the compound became known as ypirite, but just as British soldiers, unable to pronounce the French, called that town wipers, they found a new name for the gas based on its color, namely mustard gas. There was a long-standing dispute about the legacy of chemical weapons. It began our discussions about the catch-all phrase weapons of mass destruction, but in truth, a better way of understanding these is that they are weapons of mass death. What set these weapons apart? The horror associated with them, the fear? Or is it the twisting of science, that supposedly noble pursuit, into something horrific that makes us blanch at their use? Fritz Haber's wife, fellow scientist Clara Immerwahr, set a tone of this scientist's dilemma. She was opposed to her husband's chemical weapons research. Haber believed himself to be a patriot, and like others, he saw it as his duty to mobilize science to protect the fatherland. It was the same sentiment that motivated American scientists at that time to create the National Research Council during the war. Scientists should be mobilized, they thought. But Immerwahr felt differently, and after arguing with her husband, she took a pistol, his pistol, and shot herself in the heart in 1915. And the next day, Haber went to the front to try out chlorine gas. A gas attack isn't such a simple matter. You have to understand how a chemical interacts with the body. Does it blind? Does it blister? Does it suffocate? You have to understand water sources to understand who might be poisoned. You have to understand the weather, at the very least, to know which way the wind blows. Some of the most powerful images of the war from aerial photographs show just how easily a sudden shift in the wind can have a dramatic effect on who was gassing whom. Though I don't have time to discuss it today, these questions would motivate a great deal of scientific research after the Second World War, because understanding nature seemed to hold the key to prevailing and perhaps just surviving a cataclysmic future war. Images of the First World War depict a nightmare world. Barbed wire across no man's land, men and horses wearing gas masks, pockmarked landscapes comprised of mud and bodies, and life in a trench, trying to survive in a dirty hole in the earth with other men sharing food, infections, and fears. The soundscape comes to us in memoirs with that constant rat-a-tat of machine gun fire. The smell, mustard gas apparently was sweet and spicy, reminiscent of lilacs, garlic, horseradish, onions. Those interested in the history of chemicals and the natural environment may be surprised to learn that crucial questions about the right to expose other people's bodies to permanent harm were raised even then. The notion that an enemy, even in time of war, should not be allowed to tamper with your body, to manipulate it, seemed wrong. Somehow it seemed more wrong than simply killing with a gun or bomb. It sparked a lively debate. Famously, British scientist J.B.S. Haldane defended chemical weapons on the grounds that war was wrong, not a particular kind. Efforts to ban the use of such a horrifying weapon led to the Geneva Protocol in 1925. The international furor over them culminated, or rather was celebrated, or continued rather, over Fritz Haber's selection as the 1919 recipient of the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. It seemed the epitome of bad taste, much like wearing this color when talking about chemical weapons. In subsequent years, chemical weapons and biological weapons and nuclear weapons too were researched and developed by many countries, most notably the United States, which spent half a century dithering before finally signing off to the Geneva Protocol. During the Second World War, one of the big surprises was that the Germans didn't use chemical weapons. American scientists marveled at it, fully expecting after D-Day to confront the horrors of 1917 all over again. They also brought, by the way, Geiger counters in case the Germans planned to contaminate the landscape with radioactivity, and were surprised that it didn't happen. This lack of confidence in others' restraint helped Americans to justify actions that can only be described as maximizing human death, whether it was strategic bombing of World War II or citywide destruction in Cold War plans. Americans assumed that science and technology would in fact be used as weapons of massive death. In fact, in the late 1940s, the US military tried to clamp down on any uses of the term weapon of mass destruction because if there was a stigma attached to them, it would invalidate most of the promising weapons in the US arsenal, from crop killers, riot agents, biological weapons, and of course, nuclear weapons. Perhaps the greatest disillusionment was not with science and technology, but rather with human beings and the expectation of restraint.